concept of political deference, I felt had been discarded as an analytical political tool. It had been discarded because a number of political scientists in the 1970s decided that, analytically speaking, it was impossible to calculate deference. So this was something that you would use in order to define, but not even define, to describe a certain category of people. And generally in the 1970s, it was to describe the conservative voters, who were normally supposed to be deferential to the Conservative Party. But the problem was that it was extremely difficult to quantify the level of deference, because essentially, what do you quantify? What are you going to base your analysis on? So the concept itself was discarded as being useless, and ever since the 1970s, it has been used as generally as a definition or as a way of describing the British love for the monarchy. So you will often find in the press, especially, or by journalists, the expression that the British as a nation are deferential to the crown. And the whole idea for my book was the fact that there was nothing natural, or there was nothing easy to understand in the expression that the British are deferential. First of all, because the very expression, the British, meant that you were putting inside one word Scottish people, people from Northern Ireland, Welsh people, and English people, and that those different nations were supposed to be deferential to the crown. And I felt that this didn't work, that certain nations were more deferential than others, certainly the English, certainly more than, for example, part of the Catholic Republicans in Northern Ireland, for example. But that you had to, first of all, split up what you meant by the British being deferential. And then perhaps you could move on to explain the concept. And so the one person who really used the concept of political deference was Walter Bagehot. And Walter Bagehot used it in order to explain that the English were deferential to the monarchy. And this was part of his explanation as to the fact that the British Constitution, or he called it the English Constitution, I would prefer to use the term Anglo-British Constitution, because then it's easier to understand the fact that it is an English-dominating structure imposing the constitution on the other nations of the kingdom. So he explained that the English constitution was separated into two parts, the dignified and the efficient parts. The dignified parts being the monarchy and the House of Lords, and the efficient parts being the House of Commons and the Cabinet. And that it was a useful trick in order for people who didn't understand where the real power was within the efficient parts, that the dignified parts were used by what he called the masses to understand that the power was there. But in fact, the reality is that power wasn't really there. Power was really part of the cabinet inside of the dignified parts. And so what he meant by political deference is that you had certain people who would be irrationally deferential to the dignified parts, doing it through custom and traditions. And those who were rationally deferential to the efficient parts, the House of Commons and the Cabinet, would do so because they understood the working of the Constitution. So in his understanding of political deference, you had two views, those who were irrationally deferential due to the working of traditions, of customs throughout the history of the kingdom. And those who would understand really the fundamental role of the Constitution and who would give their rational deference to the efficient parts. But there was one key point in Walter Bagehot, is that he never used the term deference as something which was based on an inequality of condition. Essentially, the term deference did not mean that you would defer out of being submitting. You would defer because irrationally you would do it through traditions and customs, and you would not find this a problem. Or you would defer rationally because you would consider that the person to whom you were going to give your power was an equal and would use his power in a way in which that elite in power would have rights and duties towards you. So it's a very strong analytical political tool. It means that in a hierarchical structure such as the United Kingdom in the 19th century, there was within this expression the possibility for having what would become a fully democratic country. And this would be the case, well, in the 20th century. Well, it all started really at the time of the Jubilee of the Queen in 2012, when I kept on seeing and listening to journalists talking about British deference. And this is when I kept on wondering why they were not referring to the notion of deference the way Walter Bagehot had referred to it. And because the definition of Bagehot was pretty clear and it was pretty useful. And so I started in this way. And so I went back to the definition of Walter Bagehot. I went back to what Bagehot had been writing about, especially at the time of the Second Reform Act in 1867. And in the end, I realized that I could not only work on the 19th century, that I had to work on the end of the 18th century, and the way in which a number of thinkers, including Adam Smith, David Hume, and especially Edmund Burke, conceived the link to the elite in power, and the ways in which you could set up what would be a coming and going between the people governed and the people governing them. And then I carried on with Walter Bagehot, and especially with Benjamin Disraeli, and then with David Dicey, who was one of the great constitutionalists of the end of the 19th century. And then normally I should have stopped there, because my primary sources and my work had been based on the 19th century. But then slowly and gradually I realized that there was a lot more to say in the 20th century and the 21st century. And so the first part of the book is essentially on the theoretical framework, or if you want, on the typology of deference in the 19th century. But then it became pretty clear that there were several moments in the 20th and 20th century in which you could have a glimpse into pockets of rational and irrational deference. And that by seeing them coming up alive in certain key moments, so for example, to give you a key moment, the coronation of the Queen in June 1953, or a counterexample opposed to deference, the time in power of New Labour from 1997 to 2010, in which they reformed the constitution and in the end, a historian uses the term deformed the Anglo-British constitution, were moments in which you could see deference at work or not, and you could then realize that political deference had not died. So my analysis on the 20th and 21st century was to focus on the practical aspect of political deference, to see it alive, and therefore to try and analyze the history of the histories of political deference in the 20th and 21st century. And Brexit, the curious case of Brexit, is one of those moments, and that's why it comes into the book at the end and especially in the conclusion. Yes, because I started doing my research on the book. I went to Oxford in 2014. And of course, Brexit happened in June 2016, as I was still researching part of the book, but writing. And then the period going from 2016 to especially the general election of 2019 had a massive impact on the book being rewritten. And I had to write the last chapter on Brexit and the conclusion during the confinement of March, April and May and June 2020. Because I realized something that I hadn't seen at the time, which was in the making when I was writing. It was a sort of ghost which was there in the background, but I couldn't see it because I didn't have the benefit of hindsight. What appeared very clearly at the general election of 2019 is that there had been a realignment in British politics, which had started perhaps as soon as 2013, even 2014, at the moment when David Cameron gave the Bloomberg speech saying that he would have a referendum if the Conservative Party came back in power after 2015. There was this moment in which the decision he took and the decision taken were that they would try and pander to the ideas, to the desires of the UK party of Nigel Farage at the time. And therefore, they were trying to, in the Conservative Party, to please those people within the party who were some very much on the right, but others who were also people who believed in sovereignty of parliament, others who were very concerned with the level of criminality, those who were very worried about immigration into the country. But by doing this, they were also answering desires of a number of constituencies which used to vote for the Labour Party and which felt the same way. And that's the reason why at the time of Brexit, when you had the period at the time of the referendum going from, essentially February to June 2016, you had people like Boris Johnson being part of the Conservative Party, but he was joined by a number of Labour Party figures, like Jagela Stewart, for example. And you could see that there was a realignment of politics in the sense that the question of Brexit was cutting through parties, and that you no longer had a Conservative Party and a Labour Party and a number of other parties around them, but you had a number of people who would actually go in favour or against Brexit. And that this led to a realignment of British politics that we could see in the making in 2016, but that we really saw in the autumn of 2019, when Boris Johnson, after being elected leader of the Conservative Party in July 2019, being faced with a number of figures within the Conservative Party who were in favour of remaining, decided to expel more than 20 key figures of the Conservative Party who had been in favour of remaining. And you had, for example, two former Chancellor of the Exchequer, key figures of the Conservative Party, to essentially get rid of them because they had voted against the Conservative Party, meaning that at the general election of 2019, he had a party which was essentially very much a party in favour of Brexit. And so this sort of ruthless act of Boris Johnson, and very clever political act, was also a way of realigning politics, but also cleverly of choking the Labour Party. Because the new leader of the Labour Party is Sir Keir Starmer, who became leader in April 2020. And essentially, he finds himself at the heart of a structure of his party in which there are people who were in favour of Brexit. So he is choked by the Conservative Party, which has been realigned. And the real question is, will there be a moderate, different type of party which will emerge in the next few years? This is not very clear. And the other question, which I think is at the heart of what is happening at the moment, is whether or not Boris Johnson, who has been saying to Brexiteers that he is with them, to provincial Conservatives that he follows their ideas, but also he has been saying that he's in favour of a new Green Deal, stealing the ideas of the Labour Party. So therefore, pandering to a number of desires of the what would be called cosmopolitan, liberal, green, woke elite. Those three types of conservatives at one stage are not following the same ideas, and he will not be able to please anybody. So he will eventually meet the moment where he will have a crunch time in which you will have to decide. And this is when really we're going to see where the Conservative Party goes. Yes, this is remarkable. I met at a conference 2 years ago a Greek colleague who is a philosopher, who I was amazed to discover was in the process of writing an article on Adam Smith and the concept of deference. And so, of course, we started talking about, because I was writing my book, and so he was writing his article. And it's because of him that I decided to base my own book starting in the 18th century, because of his work. And so this colleague, who is called Spiridon Tegos, has just been invited as a visiting fellow at CY Cergy Paris Université, and has just spent a month with us. And we are working on a conference on deference, and this will certainly be at the heart of a new project of publication. Well, Elizabeth II has been a monarch for nearly 70 years. So this is quite remarkable. She is really the living link in the memory of British people to, well, basically the Second World War, her parents, to her coronation. Her first Prime Minister was Winston Churchill. When you think about this, you actually think that she has seen everything ever since she became Queen in 1952. And you can see this, for example, in The Crown. Of course, I know that a number of people have been watching it, and that's why the first episodes, I think, the first series and second series are so interesting, because what you are seeing is a historical person. What is less interesting, I think, is what is happening, well, today, because obviously enough, she has been this extraordinary figure of stability. She has also evolved with the monarchy. She has evolved with the criticism of the monarchy. And so she is the recipient of an amount of deference that it would be very difficult for any other of her successors to probably have. Certainly, somebody like Prince William, who will eventually become king, has got to link with the nation because of what happened to his mother. So the question is whether or not Prince Charles will be able to get the same amount of affection as Elizabeth II or Prince William. This is not clear yet. And of course, if you become king at the age of Prince Charles, he is well into his 70s, you do not have the same amount of time in order to create the link with the people. When Elizabeth II became queen and she was crowned, she was 25. So there will be a reference to the second Elizabethan period, which will mark the second half of the 20th century and beginning of the 21st century. The same way you had the Victorian period with Queen Victoria, the same way you had the first Elizabethan period with Queen Elizabeth I, who reigned for 45 years. It will not be the same with Prince Charles. He hasn't got 45 years. He will have perhaps 10, perhaps. He will be in the position of somebody like Edward VII, the son of Victoria, who was able to reign but for a short period of time, 9 years.